hours and hours to sort out, because a lot of people want to be as close as possible to the king or the president. So it's a lot of work for a lot of people over a few months.
We've been covering it extensively, of course, here on the BBC. What's the coverage been like in France?
It's been perhaps a bit less intense, I would say, partly because obviously it's happening in the UK, but there is a lot of interest. And I think on the French side, there is also a lot of interest into the royal family in the UK, and King Charles has a lot of positive, feeling within France, and the popularity, I would say, of the royal family in France remains quite high. So a lot of people are interested in that dimension.
I noticed a lot of pictures of Princess Catherine in the French papers.
Indeed,
thanks
indeed,
today as well. Francois, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says freeing the hostages that remain in Gaza was the focus of his latest talks with President Trump at the White House. The unscheduled meeting was the second time the two men had met in as many days to discuss efforts to agree on a 60-day ceasefire deal. Earlier, Mr. Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, said he was hopeful a 60-day truce could be agreed by the end of this week. Meanwhile, a Palestinian official has told the BBC that the current round of ongoing indirect talks between Israel and Hamas and Qatar are stalling, with a key sticking point being how aid should be delivered during any ceasefire. In Gaza itself, the Civil Defence Agency says 20 people have been killed in overnight Israeli strikes, and that includes at least 6 children. These pictures are from the Al-Shati camp in northern Gaza, reports saying 10 people were killed there. Well, here's some of what Mr. Netanyahu posted on social media after his talks with President Trump.
I had another meeting with President Trump at the White House today, and then a brief meeting with Vice President Vance. We focused on efforts to free our hostages. We're not letting up for a moment, and this is possible because of the military pressure exerted by our heroic soldiers.
Live to our Middle East analyst Sebastian Usher, who is in Jerusalem for us, and it's analysis we need from you, Seb, of where exactly you think these ceasefire talks are at, not just only in the White House, but in Qatar too.
I think we've got two things going here, haven't we? We've got an attempt to really get momentum going at this level that Mr. Netanyahu and President Trump are meeting. The fact that they've met twice in 2 days, although we aren't party to what they were discussing and how intense the pressure might have been from President Trump to try to persuade and push the Israeli Prime Minister to agree to a deal that he hasn't until recently. And on the other side, we had these indirect talks that started on Sunday, late on Sunday, in Doha, in Qatar, between Hamas and Israel. That was a step forward, but they were taking place again. And we've been hearing mixed signals, as you were saying there. Palestinian sources, a Palestinian official who's close to the talks has told the BBC the really quite downbeat message about it, saying that it feels stalled. It feels that the Israeli negotiating team isn't really of a level that is able to take decisions, everything being referred back to Tel Aviv, being referred back to Mr. Netanyahu. So a sense of frustration perhaps about that. Also, there are technicalities about the deal, this new ceasefire proposal, about the aid, as you're saying, how that will be delivered, this new mechanism, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, very controversial. Hamas wants that to be removed. They want to go back to the UN and other aid agencies, bringing in much larger amounts of aid and distributing it directly to where the Palestinians are. At the moment, from what we're hearing, the Israeli negotiating team isn't open to that. Also, there are discussions, although we don't know how far this has gone, over Israeli troops withdrawing to positions they held before the resumption of the offensive after the previous ceasefire back in March collapsed. We're hearing from some sources in the Israeli media that new maps are being presented. So there really is a sense that, yes, there's momentum at the highest level. Yes, President Trump is pushing this. Yes, his Mideast envoy, Steve Witkoff, is still saying there might be a deal at the end of this week. He may go to Doha. He may give that push. But from the talks themselves, even on the Israeli side, we're getting the sense, as I think is expected, these are very difficult issues that are being dealt with. If it were easy to get a deal, there would have been one by now. So even on the technicalities of getting a temporary ceasefire over the line, I think that there are problems. The idea of having a ceasefire which would have a guarantee in it, as Hamas wants, that there would be no fighting, there'd be no resumption of the Israeli offensive after any truce, seems to be at the moment not even in question, that this is something that is too difficult to deliver. And just in the past hour or so, we've heard from the Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Saar. He's talking about we can get a temporary ceasefire in place. He feels that is quite possible, and then can look towards a permanent ceasefire. I think this is maybe where things are going, but from the Israeli side, they would be happy. Maybe President Trump, despite what he said, would be happy to get another ceasefire in place without a necessary cast-iron guarantee that it would lead to the end of hostilities. It's whether Hamas and the other Palestinian factions are willing to accept that.
Sebastian Nasher, good to see you. Thanks for joining us from Jerusalem with an update there on the many talks taking place at the moment. Let's take a look at the day's other news now. Elon Musk's X platform has deleted posts by its artificial intelligence account Grok after it became unusable, according to some, because it praised Adolf Hitler and made anti-Semitic comments in response to questions by users. The chatbot also posted expletive-laden insults about the current Prime Minister of Poland. X said it had taken action to ban hate speech by the bot. On Friday, Elon Musk said Grok had been improved significantly. Taiwan is embarking on its largest ever series of annual war games as it counters a growing threat of invasion from China. Senior officials say the opening stages will simulate Taiwan's response in the event of a full-scale communication systems attack. Beijing claims self-ruled Taiwan as its own territory and has been showcasing new military hardware that could be used during an attempted invasion. A scientific study says a recent record-breaking heatwave experienced across European cities in June and July led to the deaths of around 2,300 people. The report said some 1,500 deaths were linked to climate change. The study looked at 12 cities where researchers said climate change had pushed temperatures by up to 4 degrees Celsius during the 10-day heatwave period. In some parts of Western Europe, temperatures exceeded 40 degrees Celsius. Now, when it comes to bread, supermarkets have a huge array of choice, and research shows the bread we eat can have a surprising impact on our health. Most bread found in shops are mass-produced and contain additives that boost the speed of production, extend shelf life, as well as enhancing flavour and texture. So what should we choose? Let's speak to BBC Studios health correspondent Melissa Hoganboom, who wrote an online piece looking at how bread is produced and what we should be eating. Now, Melissa, I know you're a big fan of sourdough. We've talked about it before. You regularly make sourdough at home. What made you start?
Yes, I make at least a loaf a week, sometimes even two. And I actually started during lockdown. Like many people, I had extra time on my hands. Supermarkets were really busy, so I thought, why not give it a try? But I must confess, I didn't start completely from scratch. A friend had actually gifted me her starter, and this, as many of you know, is that live mixture of wild yeast and bacteria that helps bread rise. You've probably seen it in people's kitchens or in the fridge. It's kind of that bubbly mixture, and it smells really, really sour. So that was what prompted me to start. But 5 years on, I find myself still keeping going. And for one, it just tastes better than bread I can buy in the supermarket. I don't have an artisan bakery close to me unless I want to go for a 15-minute walk. And also the cost. I mean, near me, it costs about £5 for a loaf, which is $6 to $7 in the US. And then as I've been progressing, I've been learning more and more about the health benefits of sourdough. So this kind of really inspired me to keep going, even though sometimes it feels like a bit of a chore.
It's so expensive, some of that artisan bread, particularly sourdough. And I'm going to make an excuse here, Melissa. I often don't have time and feel a bit intimidated about the idea of baking my own bread. So if I am going to the supermarket or to a bakery, what sort of bread should I be choosing? What's best for me?
Well, I think what really helps is that we're armed with the knowledge of what we're eating. And most of the cheaper bread found in supermarkets is mass-produced, contains additives, enhanced so shelf life, and has emulsifiers and preservatives. And although these specific ingredients aren't necessarily bad for us on its own, it's perhaps a combination of these as well as another diet high in ultra-processed foods. And also some of the bread contains extra fat like palm oil. So I found that my supermarket trips take a lot longer than usual because I find myself reading the ingredients. And my rule of thumb is to choose bread with as few ingredients as possible that you don't recognize. And if you are going for packaged bread, you might want to consider opting for whole grain instead of white, because unlike white bread, whole grain is packed with more fiber, vitamins, minerals, and seeded bread also contains healthy fats. And there's also some evidence that swapping from white bread to whole grain could reduce the risk of heart disease and even improve your gut microbiome. So it's not to say we should all buy super expensive artisan bread or make it yourself, but it's just making these conscious choices of what we're putting in our body.
So brown bread, whole grain bread, anything with grains in it is generally better? I mean, sourdough being the best, but are those the next ones on the list, Melissa?
Yeah, absolutely. But I also want to add that we shouldn't vilify all bread because it can form part of a healthy diet. Yeast-based breads do also have some benefits, including being fortified with certain vitamins and minerals. And brown bread, as we said, whole grain, is just that bit better because it also has a more gradual rise in blood sugar levels than the spike we get from white bread. And I also think that we should understand when we are eating white bread, it's actually taking the germ and bran away from the flour, so leaving just the endosperm. And whole grain bread has all of the grain, which is why it has so many beneficial health benefits.
Melissa, great to see you, and it's a fantastic article as well. For more on the story, you can read Melissa's article on the BBC website, Sourdough versus White Bread, Which Breads Should We Be Eating? It breaks down the history of supermarket loaves and the research around the health benefits of different breads. Do stay with us here on BBC News.
I will give away the vast majority of my money, and it's my full-time focus for the rest of my life.
Und wenn Menschen bei uns in Europa angekommen sind, dann finde ich, haben sie ein Recht darauf, menschlich behandelt zu werden.
He really truly loved this regime and Vladimir Putin. That's why Vladimir Putin hated him so much.
Every time I lost, I just did a deep dive into the reason why we lost.
There are times when I have noticed something more emotional in one take than the other, which I think comes from being a woman.
When the big names talk, they talk to us.
Live from London, this is BBC News. Russia launches its largest attack on Ukraine since the war began, with hundreds of drones and missiles fired. All calm at the Kremlin, Russia responds to scathing comments from Donald Trump about President Putin. Formula One team Red Bull sacks Christian Horner after 20 years as team principal. A leaked recording suggests the former Prime Minister of Bangladesh authorised the use of lethal force against protesters last year. And people are told to seek higher ground in the US state of New Mexico in the wake of flash floods. Hello, I'm Lucy Hockings. Welcome to BBC News Now. Ukraine's Air Force says Russia attacked the country overnight with its largest drone and missile strike since the full-scale invasion there 3 years ago. More than 700 drones were fired, and the attacks also included 13 cruise or ballistic missiles. This is a remarkable map. You can see the scale of the attacks here, published by United 24 Media. Gives you a real sense of the sheer number of drones that were launched, all these yellow lines crisscrossing over the country. 740 drones and missiles were used, according to Ukraine. The prime focus was the northwestern city of Lutsk. It's a transit hub for military and humanitarian aid that comes from Poland. Ukraine's state emergency service sharing these pictures of workers tackling the fires caused by the attacks. We've heard from President Zelensky as well, saying the drone attacks showed the need for biting sanctions on Russia. In a post on social media, he called it a telling attack that comes precisely at a time when so many efforts have been made to achieve peace, to establish a ceasefire, and yet only Russia continues to rebuff them all. He added, this is yet another proof of the need for sanctions. Well, all of this comes as President Trump has indicated he's running short of patience with President Putin. He suggested a deal to stop the fighting in Ukraine was possible, but he had this to say during his cabinet meeting on Tuesday, warning the president does swear in the clip you're about to hear.
We're not happy with Putin. I'm not happy with Putin. I can tell you that much right now, because he's killing a lot of people. We get a lot of bullshit thrown at us by Putin, for you want to know the truth. He's very nice all the time, but it turns out to be meaningless.
Paul Adams is in Kyiv for us. Our Russian editor Steve Rosenberg is in Moscow. They've been analysing the situation, and Paul told me about the attacks overnight.
Pretty intense night, I would imagine. I mean, that map really does give you an idea, not just of the scale of the attack, but also the kind of complexity of it, with these waves of drones being launched from different directions, some of them pursuing quite circuitous paths as they prepare the way for the main attack, which is the cruise and ballistic missiles. Now, interestingly, even though we saw this extraordinarily high number of drones, in excess of 700, we think that around half of those were decoys. And this is very typical of the way the Russians launch these aerial attacks. Huge numbers of drones, some of which are explosive, others are dummy decoys. They're designed to confuse and overwhelm Ukraine's air defenses. Those air defenses seem to have handled last night pretty well, with a huge number of these drones being either shot down or electronically diverted. But crucially, even though the Ukrainians managed to shoot down cruise missiles, they did not manage to shoot down ballistic missiles. They are the most dangerous projectiles of all, and they are the ones that Ukraine needs the Patriot missile batteries to confront. And that remains a problem because the supply of Patriots is not what Ukraine wants. And of course, last week we heard that the whole supply had been suspended, although this week Donald Trump says it has been resumed.
Steve, we've seen these sharp words from President Trump overnight directed towards Vladimir Putin. You could really sense the frustration in those comments.
Well, it's the daily Kremlin conference call. So I asked Vladimir Putin's press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, for his reaction to what Donald Trump had said, that very strong language yesterday. And Mr. Peskov was very diplomatic in his response. He said, we're pretty calm about this. Trump's way of talking is generally quite harsh. He said, we plan to continue our dialogue with Washington to mend our broken bilateral ties. And he said, we hope that Trump and his team will continue their efforts to get the peace process back to the realm of diplomacy. So the Kremlin talking diplomacy. It's a different story when you come to the Russian newspapers, which I found really interesting today. I've been following what the Russian press has been writing about Donald Trump over the last few months. Definitely a change of tone today. I just want to give you a couple of examples. This is Komsomolskaya Pravda, and it says that Donald Trump changes his mind on key issues just as easily as he changes his shoes. That's in reference to President Trump's decision to send more military assistance to Kiev. And it says that Donald Trump has no geopolitical achievements. So quite critical there. This is Moskovsky Komsomolets. It says that Donald Trump has a fickle nature, a tendency for sudden moods and chaotic changes of direction. And it says that after their last telephone conversation, the last Putin-Trump telephone call, something has broken in the Putin-Trump relationship, which is quite interesting.
Paul, I imagine President Zelensky will be happy to sense this change in tone coming from the White House. He's even said he had his best meeting yet with President Trump on Friday. Will he feel that the momentum is shifting and that there might be some movement as well on sanctions?
I'm sure they're taking heart from this change of tone, although let's not forget that it was only back in, February that President Zelensky was in the Oval Office having that catastrophic meeting with Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. I mean, as Steve was just saying, and as the Russian press is saying, this is a fickle American president whose moods are not easy to predict. But certainly the fact that we've had this resumption of military assistance, the fact that Donald Trump's rhetoric seems to be stiffening, all of that, I think, will be music to the ears of people here in Ukraine. But they will want to make sure that this is followed up with the provision of adequate air defences to enable this country to continue to withstand these aerial attacks, because each week we are now saying a new record has been broken in terms of the number of drones and missiles used to attack Ukraine's cities. And so, words, angry words, that's all great. But a means to defend Ukrainian skies at the moment is rather a more pressing priority for the Ukrainian government.
And Steve, could you just clarify for us then exactly where you think the Kremlin is at when it comes to diplomacy? Because Mr. Peskov was who you were hearing from today, but as recently as Monday, we did hear Sergei Lavrov repeating, it seemed, really maximalist demands when it comes to any kind of negotiation.
You're absolutely right. And we hear both of these messages. We hear the message from the Kremlin saying Russia is serious about a diplomatic resolution to the Ukrainian conflict. That is the message you hear almost every day from the Kremlin. On the other hand, the other message you hear from Moscow is no compromise. Russia wants everything it's asking for, and Russia will secure victory. I was in St. Petersburg a couple of weeks ago for the big International Economic Forum there. And up on stage, Vladimir Putin basically said, he delivered this message, wherever the foot of a Russian soldier steps, that is ours. That was the message he sent out at an economic forum, which is quite some message. And it's a message that suggests no compromise, that Russia is determined to push on until it achieves what it believes will be a total success.
Let's bring you some insights now from John Herbst, who is a former US ambassador to Ukraine. John, good to see you. We always have to be careful of reading too much into what President Trump has to say, of course. But do you get a sense that he's souring on President Putin?
This has been an evolving sense going back at least 2.5 months. You know, we heard starting, I don't know, late April, early May, you know, Trump saying that we're not getting what we need from Putin. Well, let's give him 2 weeks. Let's give him 2 weeks. And of course, he's given him 2 weeks ad infinitum, and nothing has happened. Because, yes, the Russians say they want a diplomatic settlement, but a diplomatic settlement completely on their terms, which is the surrendering of Ukrainian sovereignty. Trump seems to have realized that finally in this latest round. And very importantly, he said there'll be no pause in American weapons shipped to Ukraine, pause made by lower level officials who are not in sync with the president. And he's
lower
also
level, sorry, John, to interrupt. Lower level, I thought it was Pete Hegseth who made that decision.
It came from the Pentagon, absolutely. It was clearly driven by the Undersecretary for Policy, Bridge Colby, and Hegseth may have given a nod to it, but obviously no one conferred with the White House, no one conferred with the State Department, and ultimately no one conferred with the president.
We've been seeing in Russian papers today, our Russia editor was just saying some commentary that says President Trump changes his mind in the same way that he changes his shoes. With this kind of haphazard policy making then that we're getting from Washington, how is President Zelensky and his team meant to deal with them, with the US?
They are certainly pleased with this latest turn of events. And yes, Zelensky and Trump had a very good phone call on Friday. And then Trump made clear his decision that American arms would continue to flow to Ukraine. There were even statements coming from people in the administration, perhaps, for example, since Patriots are so hard to come by, and maybe Greece could give up its Patriots, and speaking of both the U.S. and Europe paying for that. So now we're even hearing that maybe the Trump team is willing to look at not just selling weapons to Ukraine, but actually providing them. So clearly Trump has been affected by this massive and barbaric increase in Russian bombing of Ukrainian cities and civilians. And, you know, this latest call that Trump had with Putin was followed by then the latest record of 500 drone and missile strikes. Now it's 700. So Trump is clearly moving in what I consider to be the right direction.
Is President Trump on board then with this new bill that will target Russia with substantial new sanctions? It seems to be gaining momentum in the Senate. This is Senator Graham's bill.
Well, this bill has been in motion since early April, and the White House was happy to have it in motion, but did not want it actually put on the floor for a vote. Your question's an apt one. Lindsey Graham says it's going to move very quickly. We'll see. We'll see if Trump is willing to open that window as well.
And what do you make? You mentioned Elbridge Colby there, that Pentagon undersecretary who made the decision on halting weapon supplies to Ukraine. He has been very big on the pivot away from Europe and a pivot towards Asia for this administration. Surely that sentiment hasn't gone away.
It hasn't gone away, but there are people inside the administration who understand that Russia is also very dangerous to American interests, and that making sure Ukraine survives as an independent and sovereign state is critical to keep Russia in line. Colby, I think, as other restrainers, took a hit within the administration because they were not enthusiastic about Trump's successful strike on Iran. And now they clearly overplayed their hand last week and have embarrassed the White House. So I think that their influence, while it remains, their presence is still there. But I don't think they have quite the recommendation power that they had 4 or 5 weeks ago.
Very interesting to talk to you. John Herbst, former US ambassador to Ukraine. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Europe's top human rights court has found Russia responsible for the downing in 2014 of a Malaysian Airlines flight over Ukraine. Flight MH17 was travelling from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur when it was shot down, killing nearly 300 people. The court found Russia was also responsible for the suffering of victims' families by denying involvement in the disaster and obstructing investigations. This ruling is largely symbolic as Moscow was expelled by the court's governing body after the invasion of Ukraine. The Kremlin dismissed the decision as void. The Formula One team Red Bull has sacked Christian Horner as team principal. The 51-year-old's dismissal comes 17 months after he was accused by a female colleague of inappropriate behaviour. He was twice cleared of the claims by the team's parent company. Christian Horner had been Red Bull's only team principal since its first Formula One season in 2005. Joe Linsky is with the BBC Sport team, and I asked him whether we know at this stage the reason behind his sacking.
Well, we don't at the moment, Lucy, but just for some wider context, obviously Christian Horner is not a driver, but he is one of the most prominent, one of the most vocal figures, really, in the Formula One paddock. He has been a team principal of Red Bull, as you say, for a very long time, since 2005, and really in the last decade has seen his public profile rise sort of in tandem with this global resurgence of Formula One, in part thanks to that Netflix documentary Drive to Survive. But after those 2 decades, we got this statement from Red Bull this morning. They said Red Bull has released Christian Horner from his operational duties with effect from today and has appointed Laurent Mekies as the CEO of Red Bull Racing. Now, we are still waiting for more answers in terms of the exact reason for Horner's departure. There has been pressure on him from a performance point of view this season, with Red Bull some way off their dominant best. But this also, as you mentioned, comes 17 months after Christian Horner faced allegations of controlling behaviour and sending inappropriate text messages to a female colleague. Horner was cleared of any claims of wrongdoing by an independent barrister, and at that point he said, "I'm not going to comment on what motives whatever person may have for doing this. My focus is on the team, my family, my wife, and going racing." And then what followed after that sequence of events was a very public display of unity with his wife, Jerry Horner, the former Spice Girl, at the Bahrain Grand Prix in March last season when they walked through the paddock today. There has been this further reaction from Red Bull, the Red Bull Group chief executive, saying, "We'd like to thank Christian Horner for his exceptional work over the last 20 years with his tireless commitment, experience, expertise and innovative thinking." But there are now several questions for this team and for Horner to answer about why this has happened so abruptly, really, this morning. I think the drivers and the sport of F1 itself are going to be seeking some more answers.
And Joe, very briefly, what has the relationship been like between Horner and the star driver at Red Bull, Max Verstappen?
Well, this season's been different for Horner. They've been so used to dominance, Red Bull, with Max Verstappen. They've had 8 drivers' championships under Horner. They've had 6 constructors' championships. But this season's not really gone all their way. Verstappen has not had the dominance he has of previous seasons. It's the McLaren drivers who've led the way in Formula One this season. And Red Bull's car and its performance has led to some criticism of Horner and the car itself, perhaps for the first time in many years. And Verstappen, who you mentioned is their star driver, he's been quite spiky in press conferences. He's had a few run-ins with a few drivers. There's also been speculation in recent weeks that he may be in talks to join Red Bull's great rival Mercedes at the end of this season, or going at the end of his contract. Now, Horner had said he was looking for improved results at the British Grand Prix at the weekend. It didn't happen. Lando Norris won on his home track, and Max Verstappen finished all the way back in 5th. So that's a sign, really, of how Red Bull have not really been hitting the heights this season that they're used to.
Stay with us around the world and across the UK. This is BBC News. The former Prime Minister of Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina, authorised her security forces to use lethal weapons against protesters in summer last year. In a leaked audio recording which has been verified by the BBC, Hasina is heard saying she has sanctioned her security forces to shoot protesters wherever they were found. An estimated 1,400 people were killed and 12,000 were injured. She's now being charged by the authorities in Bangladesh with crimes against humanity. A spokesperson for her Awami League party denied the tape showed any unlawful intention of disproportionate response. BBC Eye reporter Ridija has the details for us.
August 5th, 2024, Dhaka.